Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a snowy morning to participate in a class that I think you'll find very stimulating. It's my privilege to introduce Barry Bandstra. He's among others in this room and others at Hope Church is a gift to us from the Christian Reformed Church. He and his wife both grew up in southern Chicago and were immersed totally in the CRC subculture there. And because of that, in some ways, he decided to go to the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where he received a Bachelor of Arts degree. But he decided after that to go to Calvin Theological Seminary to get a Bachelor of Divinity degree and a Master of Arts in later on, he got a Master of Arts in philosophy and a Doctor of Philosophy degree from Yale University. A number of Calvin grads have found themselves teaching at Yale. I think the ethics man. What would be his name? Well, yeah, Waltersdorf. Nick Waltersdorf was there, and maybe Delvin Clay for a while. Maybe he studied there. But anyway, history. From 1983 until his retirement in 2021, he taught at Hope College, where he focused on biblical Hebrew, the Old Testament, and other topics in biblical studies and theology. He chaired the department for a number of years. He's the author of Genesis 1 through 11, a handbook on the Hebrew text. Take it away, Barry Bandstra.
Judy, where are you?
I'm over here.
Thanks for that kind introduction. This is a real pleasure for me to be able to do this with you. One of the things that happens when you retire is that you don't have opportunities to stay, immersed in your field and to think about it and to share it with others. So it's a great thing, and I hope we do. Over the course of the morning, especially toward the end of the presentation, have a chance to discuss some of the issues, which I think might even be live issues for us. This is the first of two, I have to get my orientation here, parts this morning and next Sunday morning on Advent. Of course, it's the Advent season, so happy Advent. Advent means coming to, and it's a season, isn't it, of hope. It's a season of expectation, and that's deeply enmeshed in the biblical tradition, both Old Testament and New Testament. My lifetime specialization is in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, and that's where we'll start. You probably don't think about the Old Testament having any Advent component. I mean, not naturally, obviously. The New Testament and the birth of Jesus and so forth is that's how we get started, right? So what I would like to do is spend some time with you discussing and kind of mining the text and other resources such as archaeology, linguistics, to understand the emergence, the coming to us of Yahweh. Now that's a term for deity that I think most of us are probably familiar with hearing by now. I know when I was growing up, I never heard the name Yahweh. Probably only beginning in the seminary did that become kind of current. Before that, of course, or probably looking at us sitting here, Jehovah is how we heard the term. So we'll get into that. Where does it come from, and so forth. So as the brief introduction to this presentation says, we're going to be looking at biblical names as one way to get into what you might call the biblical theology of Yahweh. And we're going to be talking about something called Israel's God-concept. And that's kind of maybe not familiar to us to use that kind of language. But there's a component here that we give shape to the identity and understanding and definition of God. And so we form a concept. And what I want to explore with you this morning is how Israel did that. And I think we're going to see some interesting things happening over the course of Israelite religion, the history of Israelite religion. So essentially, I just wanted to give you a hint as to where we might be going here. And it's almost kind of strange to talk about God having a history, right? But that's what we're going to be doing. And so it's my claim that Israelite religion had a very concrete historical, social, political origin, and its notion of God changed over time. And what drove those changes? We want to look at that. And as I hinted, the divine names are a significant indicator of this dynamic, I would call it dynamic process. And how, by the end, say, of the Old Testament, do we begin thinking of Yahweh as God, okay? So I'd like us to begin by looking at some terms that we'll see popping up over the course of the presentation. We'll try to define some of these terms. El, there are two ways I've heard that name being pronounced, El and Ale, and that does go back to the linguistics of the terms. Elohim, related to the term Ale or El. Baal, there's a break between the two A's in Hebrew, so you say Baal if you want to, but that's kind of pretentious. We just all say Baal. Yeah, I'm not going to press that. And Asherah, maybe some of you have heard that term if you've worked through the Old Testament, say, and of course Yahweh. Now, biblical Hebrew or Hebrew Bible El names. Very interestingly, there's this set of combined names that you find in the Old Testament. And we'll want to look at where they appear. El Elyon, some of you have heard of some of these. El Elyon, the term Elyon means high. So Almighty, high God. In fact, any of you fly into Tel Aviv on the Israeli airplane, what is their airline called? El Al. It's using these terms. El Shaddai, back to that in a second. El Olam, God eternal, and so on. God fighter, God seer. El Brit, God the covenanter. Now, if we're going to talk about El, of course, we've got to begin with Amy Grant. Familiar to most of us, I'm sure. We're kind of that generation, or a little older maybe than her generation. And this is, she's in this trance-like state whenever she sings El Shaddai. She's transformed. She's transcendent as she sings. And I choose this as a way to get into it because many of the El or Ale names are in this song. El Shaddai, well, you know it. El Elyon. Actually, it's Michael Card and John Thompson who wrote this, and they get a number of things wrong when it comes to translating terms in this particular song. And there's even some nonsense in here that's not Hebrew, but we don't need to demean it in that way. Like na, used twice, na Adonai, that's not there, and so forth. But El Shaddai, El Elyon, Ha Adonai, we'll unpack that. Why is that there? We will praise and lift you high, El Shaddai. I think the sentiment of the song is really quite wonderful, and it really caught on. It's her signature song, I think it's fair to say. But in terms of how we're going to be looking at the history of Israelite religion, this just demonstrates that we're not getting it here. Age to age, you're still the same. As we're going to see, El Shaddai and El Elyon, the El names are almost all in Genesis, the earliest stage of Israel's appropriation of deity. Their God concept begins with El, but then they kind of leave that behind and go in additional directions after that. So even her song gets it wrong. No, if we talk about the identity of God, it's beyond El. Israel has left El behind, though little things of it keep popping up in things like the Psalms. So a word about some of these terms. El. El was very, very well known in the ancient Middle East. And I want to show you in just a second, another slide, how it has penetrated virtually all of the cultures of the ancient world till today, very interestingly. Well, in Assyrian, Babylonian culture, in Aramaic culture, in Ugaritic culture, and I'll say a word about Ugarit because that becomes very important here. El is the high god. He's the one who convenes all the other gods in the assembly of the gods. But he, over time, becomes the odious god, as it were, the god who has lost his influence. And it seems as if the Baal god has taken over El's powers. He's referred to as Bull El at Ugarit, and he's pictured as seated on a throne. I think if there's any place we get this notion of God, like in Daniel 7, a God as a wizened old man with a big white beard, it comes from El. And there's a funny thing about El. As a term, it can be the name of the god, but can also just stand for God. Okay, it becomes generalized to that level. Now, this is an interesting diagram, I think. The languages of the ancient world here, the Eastern Mediterranean area, are represented. There's West Semitic and East Semitic. East Semitic, the language of the East Semitic cultures is called Akkadian, and it incorporates the Babylonians and the Assyrians over time, but goes back to the 4th millennium BC, so it's a very old culture. And what I'm trying to illustrate here, that stands for El, or sometimes it's written with an additional H or He, El. So there's a Proto-Semitic earliest root of El that means divinity. In East Semitic, it's realized as Ilu. And we know this because there are literally hundreds of thousands of clay tablets that have survived from this culture. It brings back memories when I just say the word Akkadian, because I had to take Akkadian in my graduate school years. It's the cuneiform language, you know, using a wedge on moist clay. And there are more than 500 characters in the Akkadian language. They're pictographs. They're not alphabetic like our language. So I have nightmares about Akkadian still. And then West Semitic, these are all, of course, close to the Mediterranean basin there. And Ugaritic, earliest, probably 1400 BC. Hebrew, there are like 3 variations, El, Eloah, where you get the H inserted in there, and also Elohim, more about Elohim later. The Aramaic, slightly later than Hebrew, Elaha, and Arabic, Illah. They all have il, right? And I just put this in for an illustration. The Shahada, that's the probably the John 3:16 of the Arabic Muslim culture, isn't it? There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. And you see it, La ilaha illa illahu wa Muhammadun Rasulullahi. And so you see the illah word there surfacing. There is no God, no deity, but Allah, which is then the name of the deity. Does that make some sense? I think it probably does. Then we've got the word Elohim, which is problematic. A lot of these names have multiple kinds of meanings and associations. And this name, Elohim, and there you see the Aleph, the Lam, the Hey, can be a name or a common noun. By common noun, I mean something like deity. Elohim can be either, and you can see both of them kind of in use here. We're going to come back to Exodus 6:2, which is a very important point in terms of the history of Israelite religion. But the first time it's used, it refers to God as a common noun, deity. And Elohim spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Yahweh. So the deity came to Moses and said, I am Yahweh. Now how the deity came to him, we don't know. Psalm 95:3, for a great El is Yahweh, and a great king above all Elohim. So one of the things I want to do is kind of sensitize all of us to these various ways of making reference to deity, because they really do make a difference understanding this. Now, another term, Baal. Baal becomes, in the first millennium, even in the late Bronze Age, becomes kind of the chief god of the Canaanite region. He's realized as a storm god with a thunderbolt in his hand and many plaques like this, stelae. This is from Ugarit. And again, I bring up Ugarit. I'll show some pictures in a bit. But Ugarit was a civilization on the coast of the Mediterranean in what is today Syria. Beginning in 1929, a whole cache, thousands of clay tablets were discovered at Ugarit. And it was a major civilization in the late Bronze Age. By late Bronze Age, I'm referring to like 1500 to 1200 BC. After the Bronze Age comes the Iron Age, which is the era in which Israel as a national entity emerges. And so file this away. This is going to be interesting. Why a thunderbolt in his hand? And how does that connect to the biblical material? So major figure. So this helps us to realize, Judy gave me a driveway marker here that I can use as a pointer, and I like the idea. So Mesopotamia, obviously the Akkadian and Sumerian cultures, earliest cultures, well, they're Neolithic and before cultures too, but eventually Babylonia and the Assyrians, Assyria. This is where El kind of emerged as the chief god of the pantheon. Ugarit, the coast, and so it penetrates to the northern coastal area. El is mentioned as the high god at Ugarit. Hundreds of the tablets discovered at Ugarit and translated portray Baal as the one who, he's not exactly the son of El, but he's part of the divine entourage. And Ugarit is in, as you can see, close proximity to Israel, which would be here, and Judah is down here, of course. And just because the map is here, Sinai Peninsula, okay? And we'll talk about this area significantly in just a moment. So that helps us to, I think, visualize the area, which is important. This is a picture of the ruins of Ugarit. It has been extensively excavated. Ugarit is dear to me because half of my dissertation was written about the language of Ugarit in relationship to the language of Hebrew. This is what the tablets look like. And what's really cool about Ugarit, it's the first alphabetic language in the Middle East. Remember what I said about Akkadian being pictographic, 500 more characters, because you're trying to draw pictures with wedges. But here there are only around 22 characters. Huge advancement. Can you imagine how much easier it is for a scribe to learn that as opposed to 500 characters? Wow. Deb will never, Deb is my wife, they're trying to hide in the corner, but she'll never forgive me for in my first semester in graduate school, and you're always trying to look good, right? And so she's in severe labor at Yale New Haven Hospital, and I've got flashcards. Uh-oh. Baal, here's some of the features of Baal, because this is a name that's familiar to us, along with Asherah, as we'll see. But Canaanite Baal riding on a bull. Ding, 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 ding. Ale, bull, ale. Baal riding on a bull. Canaanite religion, the bull is the throne of the deity, right? Now, what stories do we know about bulls and calves? If we know the Old Testament, of course, golden calves on Mount Sinai. And you've got calves arising in a variety of contexts. So there is this major contest. I was going to make a joke about bull, but I won't. The name means, Baal means master or lord. Interestingly, in Israeli Hebrew, the Hebrew that's spoken today in Israel, the word for husband is Baal, though they've kind of dropped that for obvious reasons. He's called the son of Dagon, not the son of Ale, interestingly. And Dagon stands for grain, but that figures in because Baal is the god of fertility, making things grow, produce, grain. It kind of struck me. I was taking a group from Hope College on a study tour of Israel and Egypt years back, and we're in the bus. We're pulling into Haifa, and there's this huge silo. Haifa is in the northern coastal area of Israel, and it's a port city, and these silos are usually in port cities, loading and unloading grain. And in Israeli character, in Hebrew characters, on this silo, what did it say? It said, Dagon. I thought, holy cow, or holy bull. And so it's an important term. And you might remember Dagon because when the Ark of the Covenant was kind of stolen in battle by the Philistines and placed in a temple, it was the temple of Dagon. So again, Dagon, the association with Baal, and the rivalry that you can imagine goes on. Called the rider on the clouds. Sister Anat, this is a bit unseemly, was his wife or his consort. And the Baal cycle talks about the life and times of Baal, and especially interesting is how he fights Mot, that's the Hebrew word for death, and Ugaritic word as well, and Yam, the sea. And he's beaten by them, and they chop him into pieces. But his sister comes to rescue him, and he comes back to life. So you have the story of a dying and a rising God. Interesting. Asherah was the wife of Baal and the mother of the gods. And there's an interesting story about her, speaking archaeologically and textually. Did God have a wife? The Israelites are encountering Asherah and giving honor to Asherah as you read the text, especially the national history of the books of Samuel and Kings and so forth. We read multiple times where the Israelites served the Baals and the Asherahs. And apparently there was some sort of cult installation that's associated with Asherah, called Asherah poles or sticks, or I think there might be an association with trees here, tree of life perhaps, mother of the gods and so forth, that would fit. And we encounter these Asherah poles and Asherah, what are called prophets, a number of times in Kings. In fact, they seem to coexist with Yahweh all the way into the time of Hezekiah, which is the 700s BC, until there's a concerted effort to get rid of them. And notably, that great contest on Mount Carmel that you're probably familiar with, Elijah and the prophets of Baal and Asherah, 450 prophets of Baal. These are really like political functionaries that support the culture of Baal, and 400 prophets of Asherah. And when Yahweh proves himself to be the deity who can send the fire, remember Baal with his lightning rod, then it was proven that Yahweh is the God, Baal is not. The text says Elijah took the 450 prophets of Baal down to the Wadi Kishon and killed them all there. I think he must have had some help. and also the prophets of Asherah. So a real deep conflict. Now there's some interesting things that have been found recently that are intriguing. Scholars are still trying to figure out what to make of them. And one is a find at this place called Kuntilat Adrud. If you can kind of get a grasp of what this is a picture of. So you've got, let's see, I'm going to go back to the stick here. That probably works better. But this is the Sinai Peninsula, essentially, right? The Mediterranean, Judah is up here, and Israel is way up here. And this town, which is on one of the major trade routes, these are all the trade routes, that's one of the reasons I put the map up here, is I think archaeologists call it a caravanserai, or an overnight caravan stop. And this was found there along with other shards, or ostraca. And this is a picture of the raw ostracon that has been reconstructed. And this was rather shocking. And so part of this inscription, and this part right here, give it a more normalized graphic, La Adonai, La Yahweh, Shomron, well, Asherah. Translated on the left there, blessed are you all to Yahweh of Shomron. Samaria is the capital of the north, and to his Asherah. So in a blessing formula, Yahweh and Asherah are joined as the source of blessing. And so what we probably get there is a hint of the popular religion of Israel, right? And you know, we want to keep that in mind when we read the Old Testament. That's the institutional religion that we're reading, right? The official religion, the religion that's made its way to us. But there's a whole stratum, isn't there, of folk religion or popular religion. Sometimes it's the object of infighting, of course. Important term for us, tetragrammaton, 4 letters. And this is what it looks like in Paleo-Hebrew. And I want to explain a couple things about this and how it's actually realized in your English Bibles, probably not to our awareness all the time. How is this, which is the original spelling of what we now come to say Yahweh is? This is Yud, He, Vav, He. Of course, Hebrew goes from right to left. And so that's how original manuscripts, and I'll give you an example, which I think is fascinating in a second. But the MT, meaning I was kind of cramped for space there. The MT is the Masoretic text, the official text of the Old Testament that is used today. Adds vowels onto these consonants. Now, you remember consonants. Well, vowels, A, E, I, O, U, sometimes Y. Only the consonants were written. Yud, He, Vav, He. Now, we've got this rule, right, in the Old Testament, you shall not take the name of the Lord in vain. So the way to protect that is not to say the name. It's logical, right? So never say God's name, because you might slip up and misuse it, or use it inappropriately, or tend to show that you control God because you know God's name. So this is one way to guard the sanctity of the name. What the early scribes did, when they ran across this, they would take the vowels, the A, E, I, O, U letters of another word, okay? And the word that they took is the word my Lord or Adonai, okay? And insert those vowels between these consonants. And so anybody who knows the tradition would know that's not a word, that's a hybrid. We can't say that, can't even pronounce it. So what you do is you pronounce the word behind the vowels and you say Adonai. So when an observant or Orthodox Jew is reading, or anybody, I tend to do it too, actually, when I come across that, I say Adonai, Adonai Elohim, or something like that. But of course, that was not understood. In Christian traditions in the Middle Ages, they tried to make a word out of that hybrid, and what do we get? Jehovah, which is not an actual word in Hebrew. Now, the last thing I'll say about this. When you're reading your Old Testament, NRSV, or probably not, I don't know if the King James printed versions do this, but where there is Yahweh in the underlying text, that will be translated as Lord, Adonai, but, and this is the finer point, the O-R-D are capital, they're small caps, so that you can keep this straight when you're reading the text. You can know when it's Yahweh, if you're in on this kind of convention. So it's important to know. Now this is a Dead Sea Scroll. It's called the Pesher or Commentary on Habakkuk. Dead Sea Scrolls, you might know, were discovered in 1948, and they date, the manuscripts date to around the 2nd century BC, so before the Christian era. And so this is a commentary on Habakkuk. And if you look closely, and I've got this, the rectangles around it, and you can, even if you don't know Hebrew, you can see that there's a difference here, right? This is the Tetragrammaton. This is the Tetragrammaton, so that the scribes used what's called Paleo Hebrew, or old style Hebrew, to them old style Hebrew, to let you know that this should be Adonai. But they're representing the text that has been handed down to them. See, it all makes kind of good sense. And this is very interesting. You know, this is unvocalized. The early texts of Hebrew were unvocalized. These are just consonants on the text. And if you knew Hebrew and you knew the Bible, you could, you know, it's like vanity license plates, right? You're given half the word, but you usually can figure out what the person is saying. Yahweh Elohim. This is interesting. This is the combination, obviously, of Yahweh and Elohim, combination found there. And so this is the first couple chapters of Genesis, the stories of creation. And one of the things I wanted to point out, why it's significant for you to develop a sensitivity to the differing names. The first story of creation, the one that's in 7 days and so forth, uses Elohim. Of course, there were no capital letters either in Hebrew, so one could just write small case G. In the beginning, when deity could be Aramaic deity, could be an Assyrian deity, whatever you want to think. In the beginning, when deity created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, and we know the story probably. But at 2:4b, we get the beginning of a second story of creation, which is really quite different. This is so abstract, distant, sun, moon, and stars, so on and so forth. Genesis 2 gives you the story of Adam and Eve and God walking in the garden with Adam and Eve and so on and so forth. Now there, the name used is Yahweh Elohim, or Lord God. And the thing to note is that looking at the two stories respectively, they're entirely consistent. It's not like they just willy-nilly go back and forth between the two names, right? Genesis 1 is only Elohim. Genesis 2:4b through 3:24 is just Yahweh Elohim. And the stories are so different, as you're probably aware. It would be fun on another occasion to talk about why we've got two stories, where they come from, this and that. It's a fascinating story, but that's not our story this morning. One of the things I wanted to point out to you is how the divine names reveal themselves in personal names, as well as, we could say, place names. Yah is, as you would guess, a shortened form of Yahweh. And we don't say, we should say Eliyahu. Those Germans had us inherit J's for Y's. And so we would say Jehovah, it's really Yehovah. So Eliyahu actually. And so you get Yahweh names and you get El names, or you get the hybrid. Deity is Yahweh. Yo is short for Yahweh. My God saves. And so on and so forth. You can see that in each one of these names, there is a shortened form of a divine name. Now, what's interesting about that is you can tell, if you trace a word later about that, regionally, where was the differing names of God used. In other words, if you're from Judah, Yehudah, then you would typically use Yahweh of your God. Okay? If you are from Israel, the north, which is in closer proximity to Aramea and to Acadia, where El, since time immemorial, was the way to refer to God, you've got an El name, which is kind of interesting, it seems to me. So you can map out where the various people are from based on the theophoric, it's called, element in the name. Now, we're moving toward the end here of the presentation. Let me just say, there is so much information out there that scholars use to try to reconstruct the Israelite history of religion. We're just touching on a couple points here. And in a sense, I apologize for this because there's so much that could be said about many of the points that come up, but so much more behind it. What I want to present to you here is that I think we can, on the basis of some of the things we've seen, but there's more behind it, there are at least 3 stages of Israelite understandings of God. The earliest stage, the ancestral period of, let's say, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the ancestral religion thought of deity as El, like we said. The tribal religion, beginning with Moses and going through until you get to Saul and David, the beginning of the nation state, the kings, that's a different understanding of God. That's where this notion of God as a divine warrior takes hold. Okay, tribal religion. They're trying to settle the tribal lands. And so they need their God to be a strong God who leads them in battle. Think of the Ark of the Covenant. Yahweh is enthroned between the cherubim, and they come and they get the ark to bring it into battle to see if they can win. Yahweh is a warrior God, can be proved in many ways. After that, after they've got the nation state settled, then Yahweh takes on all of the characteristics and apparatus of kingship. He's called the king, and he authorizes then, of course, Israel's kings. And even says of David, David, you are my son. You are my son. You can see how, if I could say it this way, the concept of God, the God concept that the Israelites are using, depends on what they need at the particular time, at the particular era in their history. And so they shape or emphasize certain features of God to meet their needs. Now, some of the details here we probably don't have time to get into. But if we look at the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy, we do find the name, even though it would fall into the ancestral religion period, right? The early Mosaic period and before. We find the name Yahweh, just like in Yahweh Elohim. But I think it's pretty easy to demonstrate that the later writers would retroject the divine name into the early period to meld the two, because they're speaking from a late point in Israel's history. But there are still many, many remnants where the authentic name appears. And when I say anthropically as a human person, it's those early stories where God appears just walking up to Abraham and chatting about, well, what are we going to do with this Sodom and Gomorrah place? Things like that. Very interesting. Next week, I want to talk about the angels, because that kind of figures in here, but I'll bracket that for now. Now, what's interesting is that there are remnant texts in the Old Testament which show an awareness of these changes in deity, their understandings of deity. And, well, that's an Ale name. That is a story about Hagar, who's kicked out of the village by Sarah, but Yahweh appears to her and says, you're going to have a kid, and that kid's going to be great too, so don't fret. Genesis 17, when Abraham was 99 years old, Yahweh appeared to Abraham and said to him, I am El Shaddai. So that's like the ancestral period. Somebody from the later period who knew Yahweh is saying, this is when El Shaddai, or El, is revealed to Abraham, ancestral religion. And then he said, 46, this is speaking to Jacob, I am the El, the deity of your father. And so there are various indicators that they knew that Yahweh was not appropriately used in the earliest period. This is just a demonstration of how Yahweh is presented time and time again. as a regular human being that carries on with one of the pre-Mosaic people, Cain, Noah, Abram, and so forth. Tribal religion now is where things change. My hero, of course. He's a warrior god. So this is pre-state. Yahweh is the deity of the Hebrew tribe. He's revealed as the tribal god. And that comes out in the lives of Moses, Joshua, and the period of the Judges. So many interesting things there. This is a key text when it comes to the names. Moses in the burning bush, you perhaps know that story. So Moses, has just killed an Egyptian and he has to flee and he's in the wilderness, and deity reveals himself to Moses in the burning bush. and he's supposed to carry that presence of God back to the Hebrews in Egypt. And Moses says, well, if I tell the people that your God is going to save you, what God is that? Because we got lots of gods. And God says to Moses, I am who I am. Key text. And in Hebrew, and of course the Gospel of John picks up on this hugely, but the original Hebrew is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. God says to Moses, I am who I am. And notice how he identifies himself with the God, the Elohim of the ancestors. Okay? Now we're at a new stage. God is telling Moses, I am who I am. And that is understood, there's some question about it yet today, as being the root of the name Yahweh. I am is Ehyeh. He is Yahweh. Same verb, Hayah. This is very telling as well. Exodus 6:2, not long after the burning bush story, Elohim spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, again, a reflection of ancestral period, as El Shaddai, and my name Yahweh I had not made known to them. Interesting. So tribal religion, Yahweh is a warrior, explicitly stated in a number of texts, and revealed in certain of their encounters with the Ark of the Covenant. How many of you paused over this in one of our most famous hymns, right? A mighty fortress is our God. You know that one, right? And in the second stanza, we probably know these words. The Prince of Darkness, grim. Oh, wait a second. You ask who that may be. Christ Jesus, it is he. Lord Sabaoth, his name. I mean, Luther was a Hebrew scholar. And he's using a Hebrew term here, Tsevaot. Tsevaot means armies. Lord of hosts, traditionally used. But that doesn't really catch the effect of it. It's armies. Okay? Even in our benediction, I was going to pull a bulletin in. There's the line in our benediction, which we will say later this morning at the end of the service, and the heavenly host, right? The heavenly host. That's the Tsevaot, the heavenly army. And we want to ask ourselves, why are we praying and hoping and looking for the blessing of the heavenly army? We don't do onward Christian soldiers anymore, but we do this, right? Anyway, the Ark of the Covenant. Again, I'm cutting something short here. Last point I want to make, really, where did Yahweh come from? If we're talking about Advent, where did Yahweh come from? Because there was a time when there was no Yahweh to the Hebrews. and yet he appeared somehow in Advent. I'm stretching it a bit by calling it an Advent, but yeah, it's the season. And so where did Yahweh come? Very interesting. You read the text closely in those early chapters of Exodus and once in Judges. Moses has 3 different fathers-in-law. Okay? Reuel, Jethro, Hobab. 3 different writing traditions that find their way into the Pentateuch. Kind of like the 2 stories of creation and so forth. But they're all related to the place called Midian, which is just south of the Dead Sea. Okay? And so the prevailing theory today, sometimes called the Midianite theory or the Kenite hypothesis, is that when Moses had fled from Egypt and took up residence with the priest of Midian, as it's called, and married Zipporah, daughter of the priest of Midian, that's where Moses learned of Yahweh and understood what Yahweh stood for and took that and used that to rally the Hebrew troops. And just so you know where that is, Midian, you can see the part of the name there, Midian. But this is possibly the area from here to here that the Midianites controlled. Some interesting support. Horvat Uzzah Ostrakhan. All of the names from this southern caravan town, this is different than Kuntil Ajrud, but all of them end in Yahu, which is short for Yahweh. And these are not Israelites. There was this sense of the south being the home of, you recognize this name? Anyway, I think we're running out of time here. I can pick up maybe some of the, just 1 or 2 points that we'll want perhaps for next week. Do we, Judy, have a minute or 2 for a question or not? 4 minutes. Okay. So basically the thesis is Israel's concept of God changed over time. What does that do for your understanding of God?
I'm Dave. This is fascinating, a bit scary. So listening to you talk about the history of religions, really to the beginning of written history, and much of our desire to keep politics and religion separate. When I listen to you, it's really not possible.
It's not possible.
Because religion is driven by politics, right?
It is. Always has been.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Scary.
I don't really have a response to that. It seems evident, though, that you're right. That you're right.
Hello, thank you so much. I was going to say, instead of questions, just keep talking for about a week. But instead of driven by, as relates to politics, I would certainly say one and the same or intertwined. But I don't want to give one as the reason for the other. I think sometimes, I could say sometimes politics requires religion to stay in place. So you can, there are a lot of relationships.
I think that's right. I would throw in the sociocultural effect here, or impulse. This battle between, again, a point I didn't get to this morning, battle between Baal and Yahweh, is really a battle not just, which God you like better, but the cultures surrounding those two deities. Baal is associated with the old Egyptian Canaanite aristocratic culture, can be proven. Yahweh, I think, under Moses, saw that Yahweh is, shall we say, more egalitarian. He's the God who cares about the people enough to save them out of Egypt, bring them into their homeland. I always come back to Joshua's profession in Joshua 24. You people, he says, he's about to die. I'm going to die here. You've got to stick with Yahweh and keep his covenant, which is a moral law to them. As for me and my household, you know the famous line, we will serve Yahweh. So I think what he's building here, what Yahweh stands for, is a different culture that is looking to take hold. And when they deviate from that, the prophets are there to say something about that. Another question, maybe?
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you. Thank you. Now, David, just as you said, fascinating, I was whispering, fascinating. We said it at about the same time. Thank you very much. Are you staying for Pizza Sunday?
We may.
Okay, if he does, you can all fight over who gets to sit with Barry today and continue this conversation. Thank you very much. Barry will be back next week. As you know, you can look at page 13 in the bulletin, where the title of the next session is The Hebrew Bible, Advent and Angels. Then we'll take a 2-week break. And no adult ed on December 28 or January 4. But then on the second Sunday in January, we're going to start our usual community partners series. And I can tell you that the 3 partners we're going to be hearing for in the month of January will be Resilience and Maple Avenue Ministries, a new partner for us, and for Culture Works. So those will be the 3 partners we'll be hear from in the month of January. And you all know that those tables back there and the tables here mean that it is indeed Pizza Sunday. So how many of you have memorized that we need 3 rows with 5 tables, very good, in each row, and 8 chairs around each table? So if you could help with that right now, that would be awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you, Barry.